Admiral Kim Hana walked into the massive council chamber, her boots echoing on the polished floor. The room was huge, big enough to hold representatives from hundreds of different alien species. Some looked like giant insects, others resembled walking trees, and a few were just floating balls of energy, contained in mechanical suits. Her Earth uniform looked plain compared to the colorful robes and armor worn by the aliens around her. The simple blue fabric with Earth's small insignia seemed almost pathetic next to their grand displays of power and wealth. The holographic screens floating above the chamber told a horrible story. Images of burning buildings, scattered bodies, and destroyed farmland filled the air. This was what remained of Kepler 442b, a peaceful human farming colony that had been home to 30,000 people just days ago. Now it was nothing but ash and rubble. "We came for resources," the Valtherian commander had said when questioned about the attack. "Your people were using land we needed. That was it. 30,000 human lives snuffed out for farmland and mining rights. No declaration of war, no negotiation. Just death delivered from space by beings who saw humans as nothing more than pests to be cleared away." Hana looked around the chamber at the faces staring back at her. Some showed boredom, others mild curiosity. A few delegates were actually sleeping, their multiple eyes closed or their mechanical forms powered down to standby mode. None of them seemed to care that an entire human colony had been wiped out. "This is our final diplomatic communication," Hana announced, her voice cutting through the quiet chatter that filled the chamber. Behind her, the other human representatives stood at attention. Commander Park Jin-woo, a tall man with kind eyes, that had seen too much war. Lieutenant Colonel Lee Min-ho, whose steady hands had guided evacuation ships away from burning colonies. Dr. Choi Yuna, the strategic advisor, whose brilliant mind had been planning for this exact moment for years, the Yeo. Valtherian delegate made a clicking sound with the insect-like parts around his mouth. Among his people, this was laughter. "Humans make threats now? Your kind has existed in space for barely 2 centuries. We have ruled the stars for millions of years." Other delegates joined in with their own versions of laughter. The hegemony. Representatives, tall beings covered in blue scales, whispered jokes to each other in their musical language. The crystalline beings from the core worlds chimed like broken bells, their way of showing amusement. Hana had expected this reaction. Humans were the newest species in the galaxy, the babies of interstellar civilization. They had no great fleets, no ancient technologies, no massive empires spanning thousands of worlds. Earth had maybe 50 colonies, scattered across nearby star systems. Most alien species controlled thousands of worlds and had populations in the trillions. But what these aliens didn't understand was that humans had spent their short time in space very carefully. Every ship that left Earth, every colony established, every diplomatic mission, they all served a larger purpose that no one suspected. Hana touched the small device on her wrist. It looked like a simple communication device, the kind any starship captain might wear. But this one was connected to a network that stretched across the entire galaxy, hidden in places no one would think to look, across every communication channel in the galaxy, from the busiest trade routes to the most remote. Frontier worlds, the same message began broadcasting at exactly the same time. To all sapient species, this is Earth's final warning. Any further unprovoked attack on human colonies or vessels will result in the immediate implementation of Protocol Omega, total galactic sterilization. You have been warned. The chamber erupted into chaos. Delegates jumped to their feet, shouting, in dozens of different languages. Some laughed even harder, thinking this was the most ridiculous bluff they had ever heard. Others looked confused, wondering what Protocol Omega could possibly mean. The hegemony representatives exchanged amused glances with each other. One of them, a female with particularly bright blue scales, actually wiped tears from her large eyes. The idea that humans could threaten the entire galaxy was apparently the funniest thing she had heard in years. But Dr. Choi Yuna just smiled quietly as she watched the alien reactions. She had spent the last 20 years preparing for this moment, calculating every detail, positioning every piece of equipment exactly where it needed to be. The other species were laughing now, but they wouldn't be laughing much longer. They had no idea what was coming. 3 days passed after Hana's warning echoed across the galaxy. In the grand palace of the Zephyrian hegemony, Overlord Krexthan sat on his crystal throne, surrounded by his war council. The massive alien looked like a cross between a lizard and a lion, with golden scales that shimmered in the artificial light. "The humans think they can frighten us with words," Krexthan said, his voice rumbling through the chamber like distant thunder. "They are like children playing with toys, pretending to be warriors." His advisors nodded in agreement. The hegemony had conquered 1,000 worlds and enslaved dozens of species. These upstart humans with their tiny colonies were nothing more than an annoyance that needed to be swatted down. "What do you suggest, my lord?" asked General Thakmor, his scales a darker shade of gold that marked him as a veteran of many wars. Krexthan smiled, showing rows of sharp teeth. "A demonstration, something small to show the galaxy that human threats mean nothing. Then we can return to the important business of expanding our territory." The target was obvious. Proxima Centauri Station was the closest human settlement to hegemony space, a simple mining operation pulling rare metals from the asteroid belt around humanity's nearest neighbor star. It wasn't even heavily defended, just 12,000 workers and their families trying to make a living in the cold depths of space. Commander Vexitar received his orders with enthusiasm. The blue-scaled warrior had been looking for an excuse to test his new warships against human technology. This would be easier than target practice. "Take the Third Fleet," Krexthan commanded. "Make it quick and clean. We want to send a message, not start a real war." Vextar bowed deeply. "It will be done, my lord. The humans will learn their place in the galaxy." 2 days later, Vextar stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching through the viewing windows as his fleet dropped out of hyperspace around Proxima Centauri. The human mining station looked tiny and fragile against the backdrop of space, like a metal flower floating among the asteroids. The human defenders fought better than expected. Their small patrol ships darted between the larger hegemony vessels, like angry wasps, their weapons leaving bright streaks across the darkness. The station's defensive platforms opened fire with everything they had, creating a spectacular light show that lit up the entire system. But it wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. The hegemony had brought 300 warships against maybe 20 human defenders. The outcome was decided before the first shot was fired. "Their shields are failing," reported Vextar's tactical officer. "The station is taking heavy damage." Vextar watched with professional interest as the human station slowly broke apart under the bombardment. Pieces of metal and debris spun away into space, each chunk representing lives lost and dreams destroyed. The human ships fought until their hulls cracked and their engines went dark, their crews choosing death over surrender. Within 6 hours it was over. The mining station was nothing but scrap metal floating in orbit. Every human in the system was dead. Workers, security guards, families, even the children who had been born among the stars and had never seen Earth. "Excellent work," Vextar told his crew. "Send word to Overlord Krexthan. Tell him the human threat has been exposed as the empty boasting we knew it was." But even as his communication officer prepared the victory message, something strange began happening throughout the galaxy. Objects that had been floating in space for decades suddenly started to move. Chunks of rock that astronomers had catalogued as asteroids began to unfold like metal flowers. Derelict ships that had been ignored as space junk powered up their engines for the first time in years. The first message came from an object in the Andromeda sector that everyone had assumed was a dead comet. It broadcast on every frequency, simultaneously, speaking in perfect hegemony dialect. "Condition Omega initiated. All sapient species have 72 hours to evacuate to designated safe zones. Failure to comply will result in termination. This is not a request." Then another message came from the core worlds, where a natural space formation had suddenly revealed itself to be an artificial construct. Then another from the outer rim, where a meteor shower that had been occurring for 20 years suddenly stopped and began transmitting instead. Thousands of messages flooded the communication networks, all saying the same thing in hundreds of different languages. The galaxy realized with growing horror that humans had been watching them for far longer than anyone had suspected. On Earth, Deep beneath the mountains of Korea, General Kang Dae-ho sat in a bunker that had been prepared for this exact moment. The walls were lined with screens showing star maps, communication feeds, and status reports from across the galaxy. This room had been waiting for decades to fulfill its purpose. Captain Song Minji, his aide, and the daughter of a family that had served in Earth's defense forces for generations, approached with a data pad in her hands. "Sir, we've received confirmation," she said quietly. "Proxima Centauri station has been destroyed, all hands lost." General Kang closed his eyes for a moment, thinking of the 12,000 people who had just died. Good people, honest people, who had committed no crime except being human, in a galaxy that saw them as expendable. "Send the activation codes," he ordered, his voice steady despite the weight of what he was about to unleash. All Damocles nodes are now weapons-free. Throughout the galaxy, hidden devices that had been mistaken for space debris, abandoned equipment, and natural phenomena began powering up for the first time in decades. The network that humanity had spent 50 years building in secret was finally awakening, and the galaxy was about to learn what humans were truly capable of when pushed too far. Dr. Shin Hyun-woo had been working on Project Damocles for 30 years, ever since he was a young graduate student studying stellar physics. Back then, everyone thought he was crazy for believing that stars could be controlled and manipulated like giant machines. Now, standing in the command center on Luna Base, he was about to prove that his crazy ideas could save humanity from extinction. The room around him buzzed with quiet activity. Dozens of technicians sat at their stations, monitoring screens filled with data that would have been impossible to understand just a few decades ago. The air hummed with the sound of computers processing calculations so complex that they required the combined computing power of every human colony in space. Above his head, a massive three-dimensional map of the galaxy slowly rotated, showing every star system, every planet, every major space route that connected the civilized worlds. For years, this map had been mostly blue and green, showing peaceful territory controlled by various alien species. But now red dots were beginning to appear across its surface, like drops of blood spreading through water. Each red dot represented something that had been hiding in space for decades, waiting for this moment. Objects that alien astronomers had catalogued as asteroids, comets, or space debris were revealing their true nature. Ancient-looking derelict ships that had been ignored for years were suddenly powering up their engines. Even some natural-looking formations on planets and moons were opening up to reveal the sophisticated technology hidden inside. Status report, Admiral Yoon Seojun called out from his position at the center of the room. The Admiral was a calm man who had spent his entire career preparing for a war he hoped would never come. Now that war was here and he was ready. Technical specialist Han Soo-young looked up from her console, her fingers dancing across holographic controls that managed systems scattered across the galaxy. 17,437. Nodes confirmed active, she reported. Stellar manipulation capabilities at full power. Gravitational anchors locked and loaded. The numbers were staggering. For 50 years, every human ship that left Earth had carried more than just colonists and supplies. Hidden in their cargo holds were pieces of technology so advanced that most humans didn't even understand how they worked. These devices had been quietly placed throughout the galaxy, disguised as everything from mining equipment to communication satellites. In one corner of the command center, a tall alien figure stood watching the proceedings with growing alarm. Kethra was a Centaurian diplomat, one of the few non-humans who had been permitted to witness the activation of humanity's secret weapon. His people were known for their intelligence and their ability to understand complex scientific concepts, but what he was seeing now challenged everything he thought he knew about physics. "This is impossible," Kethra whispered, his voice barely audible above the humming of the computers. His forearms gestured helplessly at the display, showing thousands of red dots scattered across the galaxy. "You've weaponized the galaxy itself, Doctor." Shin turned away from the main display to face the alien diplomat. His expression was serious, the look of a man who understood exactly what he had created and what it could do. "We've been preparing for this since the first human colony ship was destroyed 50 years ago," he explained calmly. "Every exploration vessel we sent out, every research station we established, every mining operation we started, they were all cover operations to position our network." Kethra's large eyes widened with understanding and horror. The surveyor ships that mapped our star systems, the science vessels that studied our planets, the traders who visited our worlds, they were all spies. "Not spies," Dr. Shin corrected. "Engineers. We weren't gathering intelligence about your military capabilities or your weaknesses. We were studying your stars, your gravity wells, your planetary systems. We needed to understand how the galaxy worked before we could turn it into a weapon." The Centaurian diplomat shook his head, his species equivalent of human disbelief. "You cannot manipulate stellar physics," he protested. "The energy requirements alone would be beyond the capabilities of any single species. It would take the combined power of every civilization in the galaxy." "You're right," Dr. Shin agreed with a slight smile. "It would be impossible using conventional technology. Fusion reactors, antimatter engines, even zero-point energy extractors. None of them could provide enough power to move stars or control gravitational fields on a galactic scale." "Then how?" Kethra demanded. Dr. Shin gestured toward the galaxy map, where the red dots were now pulsing in synchronized patterns like a vast heartbeat. "We haven't been using conventional technology. We've been using the universe's own forces against itself. Every star is a massive fusion reactor. Every planet creates gravitational fields. Every black hole warps space and time. We didn't try. To overpower these forces, we learned how to redirect them. The explanation was simple, but the execution had taken decades of careful planning. Each Damocles node was positioned at a critical point where multiple gravitational fields intersected, where stellar wind patterns converged, where the fabric of space-time was already under stress. By making tiny adjustments at these key locations, humanity could trigger chain reactions that would spread across entire star systems. On the galaxy map, the red dots began to pulse in synchronized patterns, each one positioned at critical stellar and gravitational nexus points that had taken decades to calculate and reach. The network was coming online, connecting points of light across impossible distances, creating a web of control that spanned the entire galaxy. Kethra stared at the display in stunned silence, finally understanding what he was witnessing. Humanity's true nature was finally revealed. They weren't conquerors seeking to build an empire through military might. They weren't warriors looking for glory in battle. They were engineers on a cosmic scale, species that looked at the universe itself as a machine that could be understood, controlled, and when necessary, weaponized. The galaxy was about to learn what happened when you pushed engineers too far. The demonstration had to be perfect. Humanity would only get one chance to show the galaxy what they were capable of, and it had to be so overwhelming that no one would dare test them again. The target system was located in the outer spiral, far from any inhabited worlds. The scientists had designated it as Target Alpha, a collection of 7 dead planets orbiting around a massive red giant star. No one lived there, but the system was rich in the rare metals that every spacefaring civilization needed for their starships and technology. Captain Baekji-won stood on the bridge of the observation vessel, New Seoul, watching through the reinforced viewing windows as her ship held position at a safe distance from the target system. The red giant star dominated the view, a massive ball of crimson fire that had been burning steadily for millions of years. Soon, that ancient stability would come to an end. "All stations ready, Captain," reported her first officer, Commander Yu Hanul. "We're at minimum safe distance and all recording equipment is active." Beside her, Chief Science Officer Dr. Lim Tae-hyung monitored the readings from dozens of instruments, his eyes bright with scientific curiosity and human pride. This was the moment that would prove everything they had worked toward for the past 50 years. The moment when humanity would reveal that they had learned to control the fundamental forces that governed the universe itself. "Damocles Node 1847 is activating," announced Navigation Officer Park Sun-hee from her station. "Stellar magnetic field manipulation commencing." The change began slowly. The red giant's surface, which had maintained a steady crimson glow for eons, started to shift and pulse. Darker spots appeared and disappeared, like shadows moving across the star's face. Then bright flares began erupting from the surface, but these weren't random solar storms. "Look at those patterns," Dr. Lim said in amazement. "The flares are following exact mathematical sequences. The magnetic fields are being twisted into precise configurations. The artificial magnetic fields generated by the hidden Damocles node were reaching deep into the star's core, manipulating the nuclear fusion processes that had kept it burning for millions of years. Solar flares erupted in perfectly controlled spirals, each one directed by humanity's hidden technology. The star was being turned into a weapon. Temperature rising exponentially, Dr. Lim announced, his voice filled with awe and terror at what he was witnessing. "The fusion rate is increasing beyond normal parameters. The star is being forced into premature supernova." What happened next defied everything the galaxy thought it knew about how stars worked. When a star goes supernova, it usually explodes in all directions, sending energy and matter randomly into space. But this explosion was different. The energy was being channeled and directed, following paths that had been calculated years in advance. The red giant's death wasn't random chaos. It was precise engineering on a cosmic scale. The explosion followed predetermined routes through space, creating a cascade effect that reached into neighboring star systems. 3 more stars, already destabilized by carefully placed Damocles nodes, were triggered into controlled collapse. "System 2 is going critical," reported Park Sun-hee. "System 3 showing massive stellar instability. System 4 is gone." Captain Bayek watched in silence as 4 entire star systems died in a matter of hours. Planets that had existed for billions of years were vaporized in seconds. The energy released was beyond imagination, enough to power the entire galaxy for thousands of years, all controlled and directed by human technology. Within 6 hours, an entire sector had been rendered uninhabitable, not through warfare or bombardment, not through fleets of warships or armies of soldiers, but through the calculated manipulation of cosmic forces that most species considered to be laws of nature. "Recording complete," Dr. Lim reported quietly. "All data has been transmitted to the Galactic Council and broadcast on all frequencies." Captain Bayek took a deep breath and opened a communication channel that would reach every corner of the galaxy. Her voice would be heard by trillions of beings across thousands of worlds, all of them now understanding that humanity was not what they had seemed to be. "This was our demonstration," she said simply, her words carrying the weight of the universe behind them. "We have 17,000 more nodes positioned at every critical stellar junction in the galaxy. Any one of them can trigger a cascade that will sterilize entire spiral arms." The silence that followed her transmission lasted for several long minutes. Across the galaxy, alien leaders stared at their communication screens in shock, trying to process what they had just witnessed. Species that had ruled the stars for millions of years were coming to terms with the fact that the newcomers from Earth had been quietly preparing to hold the entire galaxy hostage. Finally, a voice came through the speakers, the voice of Hegemon. Thexval, leader of the Galactic Council and one of the most powerful beings in known space. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Captain Bayek's answer was calm and direct. 72 hours. Get to the safe zones we've designated. After that, anyone still in hostile territory will be considered an acceptable loss." The ultimatum was clear. Humanity had just proven they could destroy star systems at will, and they were giving everyone 3 days to reach safety. After that, the galaxy would belong to whoever was smart enough to accept the new reality. The age of human dominance had begun not with conquest, but with the simple demonstration that they could end everything if pushed too far. The news of humanity's demonstration spread across the galaxy faster than any ship could travel. Within hours of the target Alpha system's destruction, every major communication network was flooded with the same terrifying images. 4 star systems dying in perfect sequence, their destruction controlled and directed by invisible human technology. The panic started in the wealthy core worlds, where alien politicians and business leaders had gathered for centuries to divide up the galaxy's resources among themselves. These beings, who had never known fear or uncertainty, suddenly found themselves staring at evacuation notices that had arrived from Earth. On the crystal spires of Zenthari Prime, the ruling council of the Galactic Banking Consortium held an emergency session. These were beings who controlled the flow of money and resources across thousands of worlds, who could make or break entire civilizations with a single financial decision. Now they were arguing over which ships to take and what belongings they could carry to the human-designated safe zones. "This is madness," declared Chairman Velkoth, his 6 arms gesturing wildly as he paced around the council chamber. "We cannot abandon our seats of power because of threats from these children." But even as he spoke, his own servants were already packing his personal belongings and preparing his fastest ship for departure. The chairman might bluster and rage, but he wasn't stupid enough to bet his life against human technology that could make stars explode on command. The panic spread outward from the core worlds like ripples in a pond, reaching every corner of known space. On factory worlds where alien workers had toiled for generations, production lines ground to a halt as entire populations abandoned their posts to seek passage to safety. Trade routes that had operated smoothly for millennia became clogged with desperate refugees willing to pay any price for transport. On the bridge of the hegemony flagship Eternal Dominion, Admiral Vextar stared at his navigation display with a mixture of disbelief and crushing irony. Just days ago he had been celebrating his easy victory over the human mining station at Proxima Centauri. He had felt so proud, so powerful, as he watched the human defenders die. Now he was following evacuation routes provided by those same humans, his mighty warship reduced to nothing more than a refugee transport. "Our entire fleet is to evacuate to human-designated safe zones," he asked his aide, his voice barely containing his humiliation. Communications Officer Kelnara, her normally steady voice tight with barely controlled terror, confirmed the orders that had come directly from hegemony leadership. "All military and civilian vessels are to immediately proceed to the coordinates provided by Earth, no exceptions, no delays." The irony was crushing and complete. The hegemony's third fleet, which had spent decades hunting human vessels across the galaxy, now flew in convoy formation with human ships following their guidance toward salvation. The predators had become the protected, dependent on the mercy of their former prey. Similar scenes played out across the galaxy. Proud warrior species that had never retreated from any battle found themselves fleeing toward human-controlled space. Ancient trading empires that had built their wealth on the exploitation of lesser species now begged those same species for safe passage. On Earth, in the emergency command center buried deep beneath the mountains, Director Kim Jisoo coordinated what was easily the largest refugee operation in galactic history. The room around her buzzed with constant activity as her staff worked around the clock, processing evacuation requests that poured in from every corner of known space. The scale was almost unimaginable, trillions of beings from thousands of different species, all seeking sanctuary in the safe zones that humanity had prepared. Ships of every size and design imaginable were streaming toward the designated coordinates, carrying refugees who had abandoned everything they owned to escape the threat of human retaliation. "Status on the Andorian exodus?" Director Kim asked Lieutenant Nam Woo-jin, who was managing the refugee flow from the Inner Rim territories. 12 million refugees en route to Safe Zone Tango, he reported, his fingers dancing across holographic displays that showed the real-time movement of ships across multiple star systems. The Andorian government has formally apologized for their previous hostilities and requests permission to establish a permanent embassy on Earth. Director Kim allowed herself a moment of grim satisfaction. The Andorians had been among the most vocal supporters of human extermination just months earlier. Their diplomats had given speeches at the Galactic Council calling humans a cancer on the galaxy that needed to be cut out before it could spread. Now those same diplomats were writing formal apologies and begging for Earth's protection. Colonel Go Yunji approached with another update, her tablet showing population figures that kept climbing as more refugees entered the safe zones. The Vrex Empire is requesting additional safe zones. Their population exceeds our original estimates by 40%. The Vrex were another species that had previously supported anti-human policies. Their empire controlled several hundred worlds in the Outer Rim, and they had been among the first to call for military action against human colonies. Now they were discovering that their population was much larger than Earth's intelligence services had estimated, and they needed more space in the safe zones. Approved, Director Kim replied without hesitation. Expand Safe Zone Delta to accommodate them, and send additional food and medical supplies. Even now, in humanity's moment of ultimate victory, they chose mercy over vengeance. The same species that had spent decades trying to wipe out human colonies were being fed, housed, and protected by human resources. It was a demonstration of strength that went beyond military might. It showed that humans could be trusted with the power they had claimed, but not everyone would accept their generosity. In the distant reaches of the galaxy, proud warrior cultures were making different choices, preparing for battles they could not possibly win. While most of the galaxy scrambled toward the human-designated safe zones, one empire refused to bow down. On the frozen world of Krilios Prime, far in the galactic rim where the stars grew thin and cold, the warrior culture that had dominated their sector for 10,000 years was making a very different choice. The great war hall of Krilios Prime had seen countless victories celebrated within its stone walls. Battle banners from 100 conquered worlds hung from the ceiling, and the floor was made from polished metal, taken from the hulls of defeated enemy ships. This was where the Krillian Empire had planned every major military campaign for millennia, and today it would witness the planning of their final war. Supreme Commander Gaktar stood nearly 8 feet tall, his body covered in natural armor plating that had been strengthened by decades of combat. Scars from energy weapons and blade fights marked his hide, each one a story of victory over those who had dared to challenge Krillian might. He pounded his armored fist against the ancient war table, the sound echoing through the hall like thunder. "We bow to no one," Gaktar declared, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never lost a battle, least of all to these soft-skinned weaklings who have existed in space for barely a cosmic heartbeat. Around the table, the greatest military minds of the Krillian Empire nodded their agreement. These were beings who had spent their entire lives in warfare, who viewed conflict not as a last resort but as the natural state of existence. The idea of surrendering to humans, creatures they saw as barely evolved primitives, was more offensive to them than death itself. War leader Thokran, his face a map of scars from 100 different battles, raised the concern that had been troubling many of them. "Their demonstration suggests capabilities we did not anticipate," he said carefully. 4-star systems destroyed in coordinated sequence. This implies technology beyond what our intelligence services reported. But Gaktar waved away these concerns with a dismissive gesture. "A trick," he said firmly. "Elaborate theater designed to avoid the real war they know they cannot win. Think about it. If they truly possessed such power, why give us warning? Why allow us time to prepare? They are hoping to frighten us into submission without having to prove their threats." The logic seemed sound to the assembled war leaders. The Krillian Empire had built its reputation on the principle that true strength was demonstrated through action, not words. A species with the power to destroy star systems wouldn't waste time on ultimatums. They would simply attack and let their victories speak for themselves. "What are your orders, Supreme Commander?" asked Fleet Admiral Yextor, commander of the 3rd Battle Group. Gaktar smiled, showing the sharp teeth that marked his species as natural predators. "We mobilize everything. Every ship, every warrior, every weapon in our arsenal. The entire Krillian battle fleet will mass at the galactic core and strike directly at Earth itself." The decision sent shockwaves through the assembled commanders. The Krillian battle fleet was legendary, 16 million vessels strong, the largest military force ever assembled by a single species. It included everything from massive dreadnoughts that could level planets to small fighter craft piloted by warriors who viewed death in battle as the highest honor. 16 million ships, War Leader Thokran repeated, his voice filled with savage satisfaction. Let the humans try to stop that with their parlor tricks and light shows. The mobilization began immediately, across 1,000 Krillian worlds. Warriors answered the call to what they believed would be the final battle of their civilization. Ships that had been in dry dock for decades were pulled back into service. Veterans who had retired to teach the next generation of fighters picked up their weapons once more. Even civilian vessels were converted into military transports to carry troops and supplies. 3 days later, the Krillian Empire was ready to broadcast their response to humanity's ultimatum. The message went out across all frequencies, reaching every corner of the galaxy. To the humans of Earth, the Krillian Empire has never yielded to any enemy in 10,000 years of warfare. We will not start now. Your threats mean nothing to us. Prepare for war. We would rather die as warriors than live as your subjects. The message was more than just defiance. It was a cultural statement. The Krillian Empire was announcing to the entire galaxy that some things were more important than survival, that honor and pride could not be bargained away even in the face of seemingly impossible odds. On Earth, the message was received in the same deep bunker where General Kang Deho had first authorized the activation of the Damocles network. He sat in his command chair, listening to the Krillian declaration of war with the same calm expression he had worn when ordering the deaths of star systems. Around him, his staff waited for orders. Major Jin Sulgi, his aide and one of the few people who truly understood the weight of command in this new age, approached his chair. "Response?" she asked quietly. General Kang thought about the 16 million Krillian warriors who were preparing to die for their principles. He thought about the trillions of other beings who had chosen survival over pride and were safely evacuating to human-controlled space. He thought about the network of hidden weapons that could end civilizations with a single command. Then he activated the galaxy-wide communication system and spoke a single word: acknowledged. It was perhaps the most terrifying response he could have given. No threats, no warnings, no attempts at negotiation. Just acknowledgement that the Krillian Empire had made their choice and would face the consequences. Throughout the galaxy, the automated Damocles network received the transmission and began implementing new targeting parameters. Nodes that had been in standby mode powered up to full combat readiness. Calculations that had taken years to perfect were updated with new variables, new targets, new patterns of destruction. The Krillian Empire had just declared war on the universe itself, and the universe was preparing to respond. The Krillian assault was a masterpiece of military planning that had taken months to prepare. Supreme Commander Gak-Tar had studied every human colony, every defense station, every patrol route in their territory. He knew exactly where to strike to cause maximum damage and break human morale in a single devastating blow. At precisely 800 Galactic Standard Time, 16 million Krillian warships dropped out of hyperspace simultaneously at 12 different locations across human space. The coordination was perfect, the timing flawless. Strike forces emerged like deadly flowers blooming in the darkness, their weapons already charging as they appeared. The main assault targeted Earth itself, 2 million of the Empire's finest, ships materializing at the edge of the Sol system. Smaller but equally deadly forces struck at human colonies throughout the local stellar group. Military installations that had protected human shipping lanes for decades suddenly found themselves surrounded by overwhelming enemy forces. On the bridge of his flagship Death's Honor, Supreme Commander Gak-Tar watched the initial reports streaming in from his fleet commanders. The massive warship was a monument to Krillian military might, its hull forged from the metals of conquered worlds and decorated with trophies from 1,000 victories. "Report from Strike Force Alpha," announced his communications officer. "Human orbital defenses around Earth are engaging, but they're heavily outnumbered." "Strike Force Beta reports successful insertion at the lunar system," added another officer. "Human moon bases are under heavy bombardment." Gak-Tar smiled with savage satisfaction. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. The humans had spent decades building their modest defenses, but they were facing the accumulated military might of an empire that had conquered most of their galactic sector. "Their orbital platforms are falling back," reported his tactical officer, watching the battle displays that showed human defense stations retreating toward Earth's atmosphere. "The path to Earth is opening." The Supreme Commander allowed himself a moment of triumph. Soon the human homeworld would burn just like their colonies had burned. The galaxy would see that the Krillian Empire could not be intimidated by tricks and special effects, no matter how impressive they might appear. But even as Krillian forces pressed their attack, the galaxy around them began to change in ways that defied all military logic. In the Damocles Control Center on Luna, Colonel Cho Min-soo watched the automated response protocols engaging with grim efficiency. The room was filled with the quiet hum of computers processing calculations that spanned the entire galaxy, each one triggering responses that had been prepared for this exact scenario. The system was brutally simple in its logic. Each human ship destroyed, each colony lost, each military installation overrun triggered a calculated retaliation from the stellar network. The Damocles nodes didn't distinguish between military and civilian targets. They simply identified Krillian-controlled space and began the process of making it uninhabitable. Node Cluster 4 Alpha has engaged, reported technician Ryu Ji-hoon from his station. Krillian home system showing critical stellar instability. The technician's voice was steady and professional, but everyone in the room understood what those words meant. Somewhere in the distant reaches of Krillian space, ancient stars that had burned steadily for millions of years were being forced into premature collapse. Node Cluster 7 Beta activating, added specialist Kim Yejin. Secondary Krillian colonies experiencing gravitational anomalies. More reports flooded in as the automated network responded to each Krillian attack with overwhelming retaliation. For every human vessel destroyed in battle, an entire Krillian star system became uninhabitable. Worlds that had been home to billions of Krillian citizens were being torn apart by artificially induced gravitational waves that shattered planets, like glass. The Krillian Empire wasn't just fighting humanity, they were fighting the galaxy itself. Their warriors had been trained to face enemy fleets, orbital defenses, even planetary bombardment. But they had no defense against stars that suddenly became unstable, against gravitational fields that could crush entire worlds, against the fundamental forces of the universe turning against them. Reports began reaching Supreme Commander Gaktar's flagship, but at first he couldn't believe what he was hearing. His communications officers reported star systems going dark, entire colonies, losing contact, gravitational storms that defied all known science appearing throughout Krillian space. "This is impossible," Gaktar muttered, staring at displays that showed the systematic destruction of his empire. Stars don't just explode on command, but the evidence was undeniable. For every human ship his forces destroyed, the humans were destroying entire Krillian worlds in return. The mathematics were terrifying. His empire was being erased faster than his military could advance. Supreme Commander Gaktar realized the truth too late. The humans hadn't been bluffing. Their demonstration with the Target Alpha system had been real, and now that same terrible power was being turned against every world that bore the Krillian flag. As reports came in of his homeworld beginning to show signs of stellar instability, as billions of his people faced death from forces beyond their comprehension, the proud warrior commander finally understood that some battles could not be won through courage and military might alone. With his empire burning around him and his homeworld dying behind him, Gaktar opened a desperate communication channel toward Earth. "We surrender! Call off your weapons! We surrender!" But in the Damocles Control Center, Colonel Cho could only shake his head grimly as he turned to address his staff. "The automated systems cannot be recalled once activated," he explained, his voice heavy with the weight of what was happening. "The Krillians chose this path when they declared war. By the time the Krillian assault finally ended, their empire no longer existed. 16 million warships had been reduced to scattered survivors, fleeing toward human safe zones, begging for the mercy they had never shown others. Pride had cost them everything, and the galaxy had learned the final lesson about humanity's true nature. They were not conquerors, but they were absolutely ruthless when pushed beyond their limits. 2 years had passed since the Krillian Empire burned itself out of existence in a futile war against the laws of physics. The galaxy that emerged from that conflict was fundamentally different from the one that had existed before. Quieter, more careful, and operating under rules that no one dared to break. The great powers that had once carved up spiral arms between themselves now lived within carefully designated boundaries, their expansion plans subject to approval by beings they had once dismissed as primitive newcomers. Trade routes that had been controlled by ancient merchant guilds were now regulated by human oversight committees. Military build-ups that might have once led to sector-spanning wars were now prevented by the simple knowledge that someone was always watching. Admiral Kim Hana had traded her simple Earth defense uniform for the more elaborate dress required of her new position. As the galaxy's first galactic protector, she wore the combined insignia of dozens of different species, a visual reminder that her authority came not from conquest, but from the grudging acceptance of those who had learned what happened to civilizations that pushed humanity too far. Her headquarters on New Geneva was a marvel of cooperative engineering. The planet had been chosen specifically because it belonged to no single species, a neutral world where representatives from across the galaxy could meet without any one group feeling disadvantaged. The buildings combined architectural styles from 100 different cultures, creating something entirely new that somehow managed to feel familiar to everyone. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The species that had been targeted for extinction, that had been dismissed as too weak and young to matter, now served as guardians of galactic peace. The hunters had become the protectors, and the galaxy was safer for it. Status report, Admiral. Kim requested from her deputy, General Park Min-soo, as she reviewed the morning briefings in her office overlooking the diplomatic quarter. General Park consulted his datapad, scrolling through reports from across the galaxy. The Zephyrian territories are showing full compliance with resource-sharing protocols, he reported. Their mining operations are operating within approved environmental limits, and they've submitted their quarterly production reports on schedule. The Zephyrians had been among the most aggressive expansionist powers before the New Order. Now they asked permission before establishing new mining operations and shared a portion of their extracted resources with less fortunate species. The Andorian Federation has requested permission to establish 3 new colonies, General Park continued, all within approved parameters and well away from any disputed territories. Approved, Admiral Kim replied without hesitation. Send them the standard colonization guidelines and assign a monitoring team. And the Krillian survivors. This was always the most delicate topic. The remnants of the once mighty Krillian Empire were scattered across the galaxy, many of them still struggling to understand how their entire civilization had been destroyed in a matter of hours. Integration proceeding slowly but steadily, General Park reported. The older warriors are having difficulty adapting to civilian life, but the younger generation is responding well to the new educational programs. Dr. Hong Dayun, the chief architect of the post-war reconstruction effort, approached with her daily briefing. She was one of the humans who had spent years planning for this exact scenario, the day when humanity would need to manage galactic civilization rather than simply defend themselves from it. The Galactic Resources Council has approved the proposal for joint human-alien research initiatives, she announced with obvious satisfaction. 14 species have volunteered to share their advanced technologies in exchange for access to human stellar engineering knowledge. Admiral Kim nodded approvingly. This was exactly what they had hoped for when designing the new system. The new order wasn't built on domination or exploitation, but on cooperation. Enforced cooperation, perhaps, but genuine cooperation nonetheless. The old galaxy had been ruled by species that hoarded their advantages and used superior technology to maintain control over weaker civilizations. The new galaxy operated on the principle that shared knowledge benefited everyone, and that species which contributed to the common good deserved protection and support. Any conflicts requiring intervention? Admiral Kim asked, turning to the daily security briefing. Intelligence Director Lee Soyeon stepped forward with her report. Border dispute between the Vex and Thanari clusters, she announced. 2 mining colonies established on the same asteroid field, both sides claiming historical rights to the territory. In the old galaxy, such disputes had regularly escalated into wars that could last for decades and cost millions of lives. Different species would choose sides, form alliances, and eventually drag entire sectors into conflicts that served no one's interests. Both sides have requested human arbitration rather than risk violating the expansion protocols, Director Lee continued. The transformation was remarkable. Species that had warred against each other for millennia now brought their conflicts to human mediators, knowing that the alternative was potentially facing the Damocles network. The threat of total annihilation had accomplished what thousands of years of diplomacy had failed to achieve. It had made war too expensive to contemplate. Schedule mediation sessions for both parties, Admiral Kim ordered. Standard procedure, neutral location, full cultural respect protocols, and binding. Arbitration, if they can't reach agreement on their own. And if they refuse to accept arbitration. Admiral Kim's expression grew serious. Remind them that compliance with galactic peace protocols is voluntary, she said carefully, but so is continued existence in this galaxy. It was a statement that perfectly captured the new reality. Humanity didn't force anyone to follow their rules. They simply made it clear what would happen to those who chose chaos over cooperation. The new order was harsh but fair, demanding but merciful. Species that played by the rules found themselves more prosperous and secure than they had ever been under the old system. Those that chose conflict discovered that the universe itself had become their enemy. And it worked, because everyone understood that humanity had proven they could follow through on their promises, no matter how impossible those promises might seem. 25 years had passed since Admiral Kim Hana stood before the Galactic Council and delivered humanity's final ultimatum. The galaxy that had emerged from those turbulent times was so different from the old one that many younger beings couldn't imagine how chaotic and violent things had been before the Great Awakening. In the magnificent archives of New Geneva, where the combined knowledge of hundreds of species was carefully preserved and studied, teams of historians worked tirelessly to understand exactly how the galaxy's most unlikely species had become its protectors. The building itself was a testament to cooperation. Its architecture blended styles from dozens of different worlds, creating something beautiful that belonged to everyone and no one. Professor Chang Ji-yeon, head of the Galactic Historical Institute, sat at the head of a large conference table surrounded by her research team. The group represented 12 different species, each bringing their own perspective to the monumental task of documenting the period that had changed everything. Some were tall and elegant like the Centaurians, others were crystalline beings, whose thoughts chimed like musical notes, and a few were the insectoid descendants of species that had once called for humanity's extinction. The key factor, observed Dr. Veltar, a former hegemony researcher whose blue scales had faded to silver with age, was humanity's approach to time, where we thought in terms of millennia, measuring our plans across geological ages. They planned in terms of centuries. They moved fast enough to surprise us, but slow enough to be thorough. Professor Quinshaw of the Centaurian Academy, her forearms gesturing gracefully as she spoke, added her own insight. More than that, they understood that the appearance of weakness could be strength, if properly managed. We saw them as primitive, newcomers barely worth our attention. That blindness allowed them to work undetected for decades. Professor Chang nodded thoughtfully as she considered the mountain of evidence they had collected. Our analysis suggests that humanity was preparing for this contingency from their first days in space. Every exploration mission that left Earth, every diplomatic contact they made, every trade agreement they signed, all of it was designed to position the Damocles network. The scope of human planning was staggering. For 50 years, every human ship that ventured into space had carried hidden components of the network. Every human colony established had been placed at strategic points that would allow optimal coverage of nearby star systems. Even their diplomatic failures had been calculated. By appearing weak and divided, they had encouraged their enemies to underestimate them. Student Kim Mink-young, one of the few humans in the graduate program, raised her hand with a question that had been troubling her. But why reveal it at all? Why not maintain the secret advantage indefinitely? It was Dr. Veltar who provided the answer, his ancient voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had lived through the transformation. Because humans don't conquer, they engineer solutions. The network was never meant to destroy the galaxy. It was meant to prevent the destruction of humanity by making that destruction too costly to contemplate. The conversation was interrupted by a soft chime from the monitoring station at the far end of the room. Specialist Jung Hain, who tracked first contact situations across the galaxy, looked up from her displays with a familiar expression. "Minor dispute between two newly contacted species at the galaxy's edge," she reported. "The Velkari and the Thonians have both claimed the same system. Neither species has heard of the Galactic Accords." Professor Chang smiled and announced to her students, "Standard procedure, everyone, watch and learn." The students gathered around the displays to observe as the routine played out with predictable efficiency. First came diplomatic contact, with human representatives explaining the new galactic order to the confused species. Then came the inevitable testing of boundaries as the newcomers tried to determine if the humans were serious about their claims of authority. The Velkari, a proud warrior culture not unlike the old Krillians, initially dismissed human warnings and began mobilizing their battle fleets. The Thonians, more cautious by nature, requested a demonstration of human capabilities. What followed was a carefully controlled display of power. A single Damocles node, positioned near a dead star in an uninhabited system, forced the ancient stellar remnant into a controlled collapse. The resulting gravitational waves were precisely calibrated to reach both species' homeworlds, not enough to cause damage, but enough to make every seismograph on their planets register the impossible. The demonstration lasted exactly 37 minutes. When it ended, both species immediately requested admission to the Galactic Accords and asked for human mediation of their territorial dispute. "Same result as always," Professor Chang observed to her students. In the end, like all the others, the new species chose cooperation over extinction. As the academic session ended and students began filing out to their dormitories, student Kang Seongri approached Professor Chang with a question that had been troubling him throughout the semester. "Do you think humanity will ever give up the Damocles network?" he asked quietly. Professor Chang considered the question carefully before answering. It was something she had wondered about herself many times over the years. "The network requires constant maintenance and updating," she said finally. "Stellar positions change, new gravitational anomalies appear, and the calculations must be constantly refined. When the day comes that it's no longer needed, it will simply stop working. And when will that be?" Professor Chang walked to the large window that overlooked the central courtyard of New Geneva. Below, mixed groups of human and alien children played together in the fading light of the system's twin suns. They laughed and ran and played games that would have been impossible a generation earlier. Games that required cooperation between species. Games where winning meant everyone survived. "When war becomes unthinkable, rather than merely unprofitable," she said, watching a human child help a young centaurian who had fallen while playing. "When the idea of one species destroying another becomes as foreign to us as the idea of destroying our own families." Outside in the courtyard, the children continued their games, unaware that they were living proof of humanity's greatest achievement. They had grown up in a galaxy where different species worked together, where conflicts were resolved through discussion rather than warfare, where the greatest threat to any civilization was the possibility of being excluded from the galactic community. The galaxy had learned its lesson through bitter experience. Sometimes the most dangerous predator is the one that doesn't look dangerous at all. And sometimes the greatest victory is achieved not through conquest, but through making conquest impossible for everyone. Earth's final message had been simple, but its implications were cosmic. Humanity didn't just adapt to the universe. When necessary, they remade it entirely. They had taken a galaxy ruled by fear and violence and transformed it into something that future generations would remember as the beginning of true peace. The Great Awakening was complete, and the universe was a better place for it. The end.